it, drop the bass. Now the heads.
Traditionalism is a funny old thing, isn't it? It's very selective and cherry-picked. I mean, when I talk about traditionalism, what do you think of? Odds are you think of Christian, 2.4 kids, picket fence, the kind of 1950s idea, but that isn't particularly traditional, is it? That's 60, 70 years ago, which is relatively new, relatively modern. That's a 20th century idea. And even back then, things weren't as traditional under the surface as you might have thought. There was a rich underbelly of vice and unconventional behaviour going on, much as there was in the Victorian era, which is another thing people think of as being traditionalistic. Whenever I get into discussions with people who favour traditional values, this is the kind of thing they talk about. Marriage, one man, one woman, 2.4 kids, regular work, pull yourself up by your bootstraps sort of values. And these aren't particularly traditional. These are cherry-picked, plucked, selective values that they've just chosen, apparently arbitrarily, and have decided that these are the best because they're traditional, when they're not necessarily the best way to do things, or especially traditional. They've just picked a particular era tinged with nostalgia and have picked that out to be the way to do things. And on the basis of that, that's often the gut emotional reaction that fuels their hatred of things like Islam or immigrants or whatever. They just fear change because it goes against the traditional. Now, that's fallacious reasoning. The argument from tradition is a fallacy. Just because we have always done things one way, not that we have in this case, it doesn't mean that that's the best way to do things or the only way to do things. And then the flip side is the argument from novelty. Just because something is new and different, it doesn't make it the right way to go either. I mean, codes and systems and societies are a lot like organisms. They either evolve or they die because the context in which we live changes constantly. The context of the Victorian era was very different. The context of the 1950s was very different. Traditionalism as an emotional reaction is not a good basis upon which to object to things, even though people who are traditionalists may have objections to things that may be genuinely objectionable. It's a bit odd that they pick on Islam, since Islam is a very traditionalist society with outdated views on women and homosexuality and so on, which should appeal to traditionalists, but apparently because that god wears a slightly different hat, that's what worries them. Whereas to me, as a genuine progressive, a genuine liberal, a genuine leftist, my concerns about Islam are that it is traditionalist, that it is genuinely patriarchal, all of these issues, real practical issues, not just a gut emotional reaction that people have. And these are the things that I want to challenge in that. It's odd that so many traditionalists hate Islam so much when they're fine with another invasive non-native Middle Eastern religion, Christianity. I mean, if you're going to talk about traditional European values, that should be polytheism, tribal societies, families with limited 7-year marriages if you're from the Celtic tradition or some similar ones, polygamy and polygyny, all these sorts of things. These were more traditional European values. I mean, if you're talking about traditional, how far back are you going to go? I mean, one man, one woman, marriage for love is really novel and new. I mean, that really only sort of came about post the Victorian era, where people were still marrying for money and political reasons and alliances and so on. It just if you have the slightest understanding of history, and unfortunately schools don't teach enough pre-20th century history anymore, really, maybe some 19th century history, but if you have an appreciation of history, you start to understand how arbitrary all these traditional values are, and the value of adaptation. I mean, one man, one woman, one household, raise kids. That was perhaps an optimal solution to how things were in the 1950s, when you could get a job for life and one man working was able to raise enough money to support a whole family, buy a house, a car, all of that jazz. You know, that was perhaps one of many solutions, but an optimal solution to the context in which they found themselves. These days, what situation do we find ourselves in? We find ourselves in a situation where 2 salaries barely gets you a livable lifestyle, particularly if both parties are low earners. Lots of people who can't really afford to have kids, don't have the financial security to have kids, who can't afford to purchase a house until much later in their lives. All that money being wasted on rent that could be saved up or spent otherwise in a more productive way. An optimal solution to the current context of issues around work and family and so on could even be a return to communal living or polymarriages, if people could get them to work. And that's tricky because our culture doesn't support it. But if you had 2-3 families sharing a much larger house, sharing all the bills, sharing the cost of paying for it, suddenly life becomes a lot more viable. Plus you have more people to take care of kids, to watch them, to run them places, or whatever else. So their view of traditionalism is very set and kind of pointless and arbitrary. And these solutions that existed way in the past, it took a village to raise a child. Children were raised communally, taking care of each other, often because people died quite young, leaving plenty of orphans. You know, that kind of approach, that kind of communal approach, might be better adapted to the current economic and social situation in which we find ourselves. But you won't find that traditional value being put forward, will you? Now, there are elements of the far right that have sought to adopt old, pagan, tribal, pre-Christian European traditions, which is unfortunate because it doesn't really match up to their values. I guess they see it in terms of a warrior tradition or a European identity, and that part I can understand. I feel that the pre-Christian European myths certainly speak more to me than Christianity or any other. I don't believe that they're true, but the stories and the mythology and the iconography and all of that, just culturally and situationally, speaks to me much more. I mean, I live in the south of England. We're surrounded by stone circles and woods and forests and menhirs and hill forts and carvings into hillsides and all the rest of it. I live in a mythic landscape for that pre-Christian tradition. You can't throw a stone without hitting a pre-Christian tradition that's perpetuated in villages and so on around here, like well worship or tree worship. It's been Christianized, but not completely. So I can understand that aspect, but their intolerance and their racism doesn't fit with those pre-Christian traditions. I mean, all across Europe there were variations on similar pantheistic beliefs, and that seemed to foster a degree of tolerance, so much as you could expect back then, even between pre-Christian Rome and the local tribes, because you could say, your war god is similar to our war god, your king of the gods is similar to our king of the gods. So you'll find variations on the Celtic and Pictish and Norse and Germanic pantheons and traditions, and Gaulish as well, everywhere. And then Christianity comes along and fucks that all up with its intolerance and violence and preaching. But to hidebound yourself to tradition, or to think that just because something is new it must necessarily be better, both of these are fallacious modes of thinking. There is nothing special or particularly good about what they consider to be the traditional lifestyle. Indeed, as I've spelled out, it may well be maladaptive to the current context and situation in which we find ourselves in our lives. So what we should be doing, ideally, not that we ever will, is looking at our situation, looking at our context, understanding how things have worked in the past, coming up with novel ideas, testing them, trying them, and finding what works, what genuinely works. And we need to constantly update and evolve that in just the same way that organisms continue to evolve and adapt to their contexts. Just something to think about. You don't have to agree with me. Whether you do or not, you can leave a comment, and I'll see you later. Zang. Grim gave a big yawn and settled down to sleep. And of course, when Grim goes to sleep, all of his friends go to sleep too. The people on the internet were just text on a screen, the collectibles were just cheap plastic tat, and the books were just elaborate sandwiches made of wood and paper. Even Grim himself, once he was asleep, was just an old saggy goth twat, baggy and a bit loose at the seams, and nobody loved him.